All right, here we go. Day 30 of 30. This is the last day of the program. We're going to finish the last section of the program. And then after today's content, I'll do a little bit of a program to close, but just stop, reflect. You've come through 30 of these recorded mentorship sessions. You better have done all the exercises as well because they help to instill the habits, and then immediately bringing what you're learning here into your leadership practice. It's very important. So the first week, we focus on our own empowerment. Second week, our team's empowerment by looking at our habits and our probability of success and creating more success consistently through motivation and accessibility, driving the behaviors that we want. Third week, we focus on that targeting and defining those targets and creating our strategy. Fourth week, it was about the execution and the scaling of that execution of the strategy to get the outcomes that we've been targeting. Fifth week, all about building our leadership, expanding our scope through direct and indirect leadership by converting our strategies into frameworks and getting others to implement them, and serving as that leader and leading through them to recognize the accomplishments for them and yourself as well. Now, the sixth week is all about making sure the value you're creating is being represented. So the value from the things that you create and you use and that others use and create outcomes, but as well as the value of the experience of working with you and what that creates for yourself and others. So we want to make sure we get that down. This week, for the first 4 sections of the week, we've gone through forms of communication, looking at authenticity, risk-taking, as well as understanding that we're going to put ourselves out there as leaders. Sometimes we might get burnt, and what are some recovery strategies? And we also then looked at different mediums of communications and what it means to communicate through those mediums. Today, we're going to close out the program on a couple of those mediums, some very popular mediums, presentations and emails. And what's really important here, just like everything else, and it's not just this week in the communications, but everything that we've done through these recorded mentorship sessions up until this point is to apply what you've previously learned and adopt it to these next sections. And then when you put it into practice, make the appropriate adaptations that you need to make based upon your situation. So presentations, they exist in 2 forms. It's basically a takeaway or the presentation itself. So a takeaway is basically you're putting together a document in a slide format that somebody could read and they would basically understand everything that you're proposing without you having to say anything. I actually don't really like that because I don't think that's an effective use of the medium. If you're going to do something like that, you can put together a report and a document, and you can maybe offer some time to answer questions around it. So I think there's a little bit of a gray area there. However, in my mind, true presentation is when your slides enable the conversation, help to guide the conversation, but your slides are not the main source of information. You are articulating the main points, you are giving the context, you are driving the narrative, you are facilitating the conversation. Another key thing in the prior things that we discussed earlier this week in communications is to bring forward the concept of headlines and not headings. So generally, at the top of your slide, that should articulate the main point of the slide, not tell you what the subject matter is. So not summary, but the plus 37% week over week, et cetera, that we demonstrated in the prior mentorship sessions. So please keep that in mind and then incorporate the other written and verbal principles that we discussed into the creation of the content and the presentation of the content. So you can bring forth things from the meetings like agendas, objectives, bringing forward the decisions that need to be made as part of the presentation. You can include that as well in this format to facilitate the conversation around what you are displaying in your slides. Some other important considerations. A presentation is not a novel. It is a conversation guide, especially when it's not a takeaway. So that means that if you put a lot of content on your presentations, people are going to read and not listen to what you're saying, even if you do slide animations. Generally, I try to avoid animations. what you see on the screen articulates the main point and then subpoints. And then I do the voiceover and I invite the conversation. I use different techniques. If I want to start to get people to talk about what's on the slide, I would use the imagine or the what if technique to get people to start talking about the content. Like, imagine we were able to achieve this goal. How do you think this might change what you're doing with your team? Or what does success look like for you within the context of achieving this goal? So using these mechanisms to inspire the conversation. Again, you could be giving a presentation where the objective is not to create communication, but it's strictly to relay some information and then make a recommendation or an ask, especially in executive presentations where you've got 5 or 7 minutes and you got to run through it. And one of the core things from an executive team is decision making. You will need to consider that. Also, think about different styles or methods of presenting your content. So don't bury the lead, and that might be a typo because I think lead is actually from a form of typesetting. It might be LED, or perhaps I'm wrong. I'm sure somebody can offer me a comment here and correct me if necessary, and I would appreciate that feedback. But don't bury the lead. So that basically means, let's say you're in front of an executive team, they understand the subject matter. You don't really need to educate them on the background. You want to give them that big thing that they need to know immediately, and then break out the presentation of the content and the conversation based upon that big thing. Do you need to give them some details around that big topic? And do you need to ask some questions to clarify some information? Once you give them that significant piece of information and the detail and the context, do you need to ask for a decision around it? And so this is a really good approach to short meetings with executives where the subject matter expertise is known by the group. But what if the group doesn't really understand the subject matter expertise? And if you were to bring forward the lead, they would say to you, so what? Like, I don't get it. Why is this even important? In that case, you're going to want to build to the lead. So you will want to provide them with the subject matter, the education, and then help them to understand why the big thing that is important to them, and why they should be listening to your recommendation, or why they should be making a decision on what you're proposing. So the key thing here is really that understanding of the subject matter expertise or not. And generally, these two things are shorter formats. If you have to build to the lead in a longer format, it can be very boring for the audience. Because again, maybe they don't understand a lot of what you're presenting and you're trying to educate them over time, and they didn't realize that they signed up for a 45-minute hour like teaching module. And you may not have the opportunity to have that amount of time with certain groups of leaders. So I highly recommend not using build to the lead in longer formats. For longer formats, you can take the following approaches because they're designed to keep people's attention. So imagine this is a line, and for good problem solution and the bright future, talk about what's happening that's going well. And then all of a sudden there's a problem and it dips below the line. And then you have a solution. And then based upon the solution, there's a bright future. And you go all the way up to the right. So as an example, I could be presenting to executive staff. We've got 10 client opportunities currently happening and that we're engaging with. All of those opportunities are getting to this point in the engagement. However, once we get to the next point of the engagement, we're finding a lot of objections from our clients that are really slowing down our anticipated expected close dates and timelines. But we figured out that if we can just take 0.25% of our budget to invest in this piece of technology and implement it in 2 weeks, we can not only handle this objection, but we can increase the number of engagements that we can handle in the pipeline by 50%. And we're forecasting that our close rate will increase by 20%. So you see how I started out, we're doing a good job, but there's a problem. We can't get past this point in the pipeline. We just need this little investment as part of the solution. If we do that, there's a huge bright future ahead with all of these benefits. So that's our ask. So that keeps the attention. That works for short and long conversations as well. So you can decide to use that method and try it out too. Then there's the up and down. So again, if you have that line in the middle, it's just this constant articulation of content that presents a problem, creates a solution, shows something that's wrong, shows the bright future. So it's this constant dynamic that really keeps the attention. Not a big fan of that approach, actually, because I think it's kind of gimmicky, because you're really leveraging it just to keep people tuned into you. It could be useful for storytelling, because if you notice, like in a lot of stories, there's a lot of ups and downs. That helps to keep attention. So you see that in formats like movies or recorded content. That could potentially be useful. If you want, give it a try. I don't often use that format. My preference usually is with not to bury the lead, and then also the good problem solution and the bright future. I find that can sometimes be an effective way to educate while also holding people's attention. All right, so we are at the time of this recording in the middle of the pandemic. Hopefully we're starting to come out of it. This has really shifted us to even further to virtual presentations. There is no anticipation that this trend will change and will likely move more and more towards it. So we need to develop skills in order to be a strong facilitator, presenter, and leader over these formats and inspire, make people feel confident through these formats. So just some logistics around this. Your camera is their eye. So I'm not always great at doing this because sometimes I need to look off on the screen to make sure that I'm pacing ahead. Also, the positioning of my camera is sometimes in front of the content, and sometimes I have to look around it. But however, if you look at the camera, you're looking into the person's eyes, and it gives that sense of eye-to-eye communication. So you can establish that by looking at the camera. Again, this is one of those things that might feel awkward when you do it, but actually to the person on the other side of the screen, it feels very natural to them. You can consider investing in certain types of equipment that might put the camera in the center of your screen. I've seen cameras that hang down the screen and it's like a little lens, and you just look directly at the screen. So you get to see your content and you get to look the person in the eye at the same time through the camera. Just hold 1 second, I'm getting a phone call. All right, we're back. It's the reality of sometimes presenting. Important phone calls come in and you've got to pick them up. So camera, go in the center. It makes it seem like you're looking the person in the eye and reestablishes that face-to-face connection. Consider good equipment. So I've invested in an HD camera. I've got some lighting that shines on my face. That's the sun that's doing that right now in terms of the shadows. You're going to be sitting in front of a computer and presenting. Make an effort from a visual standpoint to also up your game. Monitor what's happening in the tiles, right? You're facilitating the presentation. You may want to ask questions, get a feel for the virtual room. Look what's happening. Are people paying attention? Are people off to the side? This is where if you start to see things like that, you can prompt people and ask them for their feedback in the middle of the presentation to see if they have any thoughts, just to check in. This also gives people the heads up that you may call on them, so they may pay attention more. So be that conscious facilitator. Apply the techniques that I just mentioned, and also apply techniques that you used for meetings, like things for setting agendas, bringing forward like the request for decisions and asks and recommendations, holding yourself to certain time frames around the different items that you're going to cover in the presentation and make sure that you're hitting them. And also thinking about if somebody raises something and it takes you on a tangent, is a valuable tangent, can you reprioritize, or do you need to pause that conversation and maybe break it out into another conversation at another time. Deploy those techniques as part of the presentation. Email. Okay, so this is probably the #1 form of presentation of communication that you're going to get in your firm, or it's being replaced by other formats like Slack and messaging. But just be really aware of one thing. There's a lot of email that's going around offices. People can just start to get fatigued of the format, especially in larger organizations. You have these tons of newsletters, like tons of information that constantly need to be reviewed through these formats. And what do people start doing if they sometimes don't open the messages, or if they do open them, they scan really quickly. So if you're going to send that email, make sure that it does serve a real purpose and you're going to have the objective around it, and consider an alternative format if it's not really necessary, or you don't necessarily need to share the information. Maybe sending a quick message. And if you do send a message to somebody, don't have an expectation that they're going to get back to you immediately. Like, I think one of the challenges that we're seeing in the workforce is this constant context switching between these different forms of communication. So as part of your own showing up to the role and your time quality management, as well as your time quantity management, really put boundaries around this context switching into different things, especially when forms of communication can be distracting. So I also mentioned that scanning is likely. So bring forth a lot of the written principles that we discussed in terms of the communications, using headlines, not headings, using some kind of too long didn't read or summary that's focused on the headline and a bit of context and the potential ask. Include the asks, include the headline, not the heading, and the detail that supports the headline. Incorporate these things into your message and bold the headlines. Use bullets so that people can quickly understand what you've got to say and what you need to ask and what you need from them immediately. So it might take you some time in investing and making sure your communications are structured, especially email, in this way, but it pays off. People are going to see how you communicate, how you consider their time, your methods of communication, your directness, your empathy, and your focus, and you're adding value. They're seeing how your communications add value to the firm. So don't skimp out when it comes to emails. Continue to apply these principles. All right, so what are your action items for today? Look at prior presentations and emails and rehearse delivering your presentations in some of the techniques that we discussed today while incorporating the other techniques. We talked about a lot of ways of improving verbal communication as well as written communication. So take a prior presentation, practice applying these principles. Take an email that maybe you've written previously, especially one that was lengthy. How can you convert it into a structure that is scannable? How can you convert it into a structure that uses headlines, not headings, and supporting details, that has too long didn't read, that includes some kind of ask or recommendation? Practice doing it on a prior email, or if you've got a communication coming up, practice structuring those communications, those presentations and emails in these ways. Invest the time to get your communications right, because it is ultimately the vehicle for which the value you are creating, both from the use of the things that you deliver, as well as the experience of working with you, that is the value, that is how it is recognized through your form, your ability to communicate. So invest the time in the prep and the practice to get this right. All right, that closes out the program. I'll do a brief program review in the next video, but let's close out week 6 here. Going back to that statement about all leadership is communication. We're focused on motivating ourselves and others to make our targeted outcomes more accessible and consistently probable. Like, we're communicating out so that happens. And we're building our leadership brand in the process. So what did we cover this week? Different forms of communications, the importance of aligning objectives, their variability, some do's and don'ts, feeling awkward sometimes in communications, but in reality, that's what we feel inside, not necessarily what the viewer sees. That if we're putting our neck out there, that we might take risks, we need to be authentic, especially when it comes from a place of helping the business and other members of our team. And sometimes we could get burnt. And what are some strategies to recover from that and use that as a branding experience for your leadership? Meetings and facilitation, really nailing these things, driving the meeting towards the outcome, a limited amount of time. What is the uniqueness of a meeting of that format? How can you leverage the uniqueness of that format to build your brand and also to drive towards your targets and the targets of others as well? Some general written and verbal communication things to be doing to apply across all forms of communication that you are articulating. So thinking about pauses and fillers and how that's awkward for you, but not for the audience. Using modulation and dynamics to bring people in and out in terms of your verbal communications. And on the written communication side, structures around articulating your points in a very effective and efficient way so that you can give the value you need to give to the reader and they can give the value back to you. And then finally, presentations and emails. Some considerations around these formats and incorporation of what we've previously discussed in this week into those formats, and to leverage the uniqueness of presentations to really build your brand and to drive towards your targets, and the considerations of emails and how to use that in a way that communicates your leadership brand and your accomplishments that you're making while not getting thrown in the trash or not even being read at all. With that, that concludes the program. Congratulations, celebrate. You've made it through the 30 mentorship sessions as well as 30 exercises. If you haven't done them all, go back and do them and apply them to your leadership practice. So I'm going to return for one more video just to cover the program overview, but great job, celebrate, congratulations. You're through the program, or at least you're through the recordings. Do the exercises, make sure you also take part in the group mentorship sessions. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. And I look forward to one more video and just summarizing everything. All right, great job.